Hello everybody, Luis here, and let's talk C#. So in this video, we'll learn arrays, okay? So if you know what variables are and you know how to work with them, this will be so easy for you to go from variables to arrays. So let's look at the code. So let's say I want to create an integer variable, and I'm gonna call it number, okay? And I'm gonna say that's equal to 1, okay? So effectively, what I'm doing here is I'm creating one variable, I'm calling it number, and I'm assigning the value 1 to it, right? And variables, the way they work, they can only store one number at a time, okay? And what that means is that if I change this number to 5, then the 1 is gone, okay? That's history. And essentially, that's the way variables work. And I'm calling it variables, and C# is an object-oriented programming language, so these are actually objects, but I don't want to get hung up on terminology here. I just want to use simple words, just make sure that everybody's on the same page, okay? So the way variables work, if this number is 5, I go back to 1, the 5 is gone, okay? Because variables can only hold one value at a time, okay? Arrays, however, let me actually throw in a note here. Okay, so it can only store one value at a time, okay? And these are variables, okay? So arrays, on the other hand, they are capable of storing multiple values at the same time, okay? Okay, so that's the main difference, okay? So a simple variable can store just one object or one value at a time, while arrays are actually able to store multiple numbers or multiple objects at the same time, okay? So what if I want to create an array of numbers? Okay, so the way I declare an array, let's take a look at that. So declaring an array. Okay, so how do I declare an array? Well, almost the same way that I would declare a variable, really. So for example, I want to create an array of numbers. I want to make it integer type. So let's say I throw in my int keyword in there, because that's the data type I'm dealing with for this example, for this array. But I have to tell C# that this is actually an array, it's not just one individual number. So I have to throw in a pair of square brackets there. Okay, and I'm going to call it numbers. Okay, so that's how I declare an array. It's very simple, right? The only difference really from what we've been doing so far is the square brackets. So cool. So that's how I declare an array. Now, how can I initialize an array? There are actually a couple of things that we can, a couple of ways that we can do that. So the first one, let's say that I want to initialize an empty array. And this would be useful for situations in which I want to create an array, but I don't know what the array elements will be. I don't know what the values will be. So that's why I would create an empty array. So essentially, there are two things that you have to know when you're working with arrays. Two things you have to know right off the bat. One, what data type is this array? And two, what is the size of this array? Okay. Now, in C#, there are ways that you can change the array size if you want to after the array has been created. But I don't know if that is necessarily considered good practice, because if you want something, if you want a collection that has a dynamic size, it would probably go with a different data structure or a different kind of collection. So essentially, the idea is that for the purposes of this course, let's just assume that there are two things that you have to know: the data type and the size okay? So I do know the data type of this array. It's an integer data type, so it's an array of integers. So when I'm initializing an empty array, I have to know its size, right? And I can do something like numbers equals new. So that's a keyword in C#. I'm essentially telling C# that I want to create a new object. And it's an integer array, so I have to throw in the int square brackets, all right? So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new array of integers, but I do have to know its size, right? And the size goes in here in the square brackets. So if I want to create a new array of size 3, the 3 has to go in there, okay? So that's how I initialize an empty array, and I'm gonna say of size 3, okay? Now, I do have an empty array, and what it looks like now is something like this. Like 3 empty slots, okay? Because the array has been initialized, it exists as an object, but it's empty, right? So how do I populate this array? Or in other words, how do I assign values to each one of these elements? So we have to remember that arrays are, well, first of all, they are indexed, okay? So I can access them the same way I would access any indexed object, and their indexes are 0 based, okay? What that means is that the first element right here, its index is 0. The second one has an index of 1, and the third and last has an index of 2, okay? So you have to be careful, because even though this array is of size 3, and you do see the number 3 there, the index of the very last element is 2, okay? And that's because the count starts at 0. All right, so what if I want to populate this array? That's easy too. So remember I said they are indexed, so you can essentially access those individual elements the same way you would access any indexed object. That's what I mean. So you can just throw in your numbers. That's what your variable is called, or that's what your array is called. You have to throw in the square brackets, and let's say I want to store a number in the first element of that array. So the first element is index 0, okay? So that's how I can access individual elements inside an array. So the first element, index 0, and that is how I access it. And I can just treat it as I would treat any other variable. So if I want to assign a value to a variable, I just go ahead and say numbers, position 0 is equal to 1. Okay, I can go ahead and populate the second one as well. Let's say the second one is 5. I have a little typo here. The very last element, let's say it'll be 10. Okay, so I've just populated my array, and that's as simple as that. And if I'm not happy with this value right here, I can actually reassign it. So I can go ahead and say numbers 0 equals maybe 2. Okay, this is legal C#. All right. So this is very straightforward, and that's how it works. And if I want to, I already have my array. Say that for example, I could have collected these numbers from the user, right? And now what I want to do is I want to just show them what each individual number is. So if that's the case, I can just say something like, your number is, this is not an exercise or anything, this is not what we're doing, but just for the sake of the example, this is what I would do. Numbers, and I can throw in my square brackets and the 0 because I want to display the user the very first element in that array. Okay, if I run this, There we go. Your number is 2 because the number 2 was the last number I assigned to array numbers, position 0. Okay? This is really straightforward. So this is how you would essentially create an array, an empty array, and populate it. Now there are times, however, that you want to create an array, but you already know right off the bat what the elements are going to be. Okay, so for that situation, you can do something like this: declaring and initializing an array, or let's say a known array. Okay, so let's say I want to create an array that has the days of the week, right? So I'm going to create a string array, and that's how you would do it. I'm going to call it days, okay? Now, this thing that I'm doing here, throwing in the data type and adding the square brackets, a pair of square brackets at the end, these would work with any data type. So if I wanted a Boolean array, these would work for Booleans as well. So essentially any data type, and that includes custom types as well. Okay? If you don't know what custom types are, don't worry, we are going to talk about it as well. Not in this video, in the future. Okay? So what if I already know my array values? Two ways I can tackle this problem. So I can essentially just initialize it to a new string array of size 7, because we have 7 days in a week, okay? And then I can just go ahead and say something like days 0 equals Sunday, and etc. So that is a fine approach, it works. But there's a better way. Well, I don't know if it's better, I don't know what constitutes a better way of creating an array, but I know a faster way, which is by just using curly braces, okay? So this would actually let me initialize an array with a set of known values, okay? So because I already know all the days of the week, I can just go ahead and say Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Okay? So I already know what the days of the week are. So I can just initialize my array with a set of known values, and that's the way I would do it. Okay? One thing that I have to highlight is that something you cannot do is just declare the array and then try to initialize it using this technique afterwards. That does not work. Okay? So if you want to use this technique, you have to declare and initialize the array at the same time. Okay? And this is how you would do it. And again, if I want to display a specific position of this array, I would just say days, and then I can use my index 0, for example, to retrieve the first element in my array, which in this case, hopefully, the console will read Sunday. And it does. Okay? So essentially, this is all there is to know about arrays. As a recap, one, when you're declaring an array, there are two things that you have to know. All right, the first one is the data type, and the second one is the size of that array. Okay, so these are the premises that we're working with, at least for this course, because it's an introductory course. We won't talk about changing array size or anything like that, because we just don't have to. And we'll have another video in the future where we'll talk about more sophisticated data structures, like lists, dictionaries, and all that kind of thing, which are dynamic in size. So we will probably choose to go with these data structures instead, to solve problems that need dynamic size collections. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope this is clear, and I'll see you all next time. Cheers.